Our next speaker is Susan Matt, who is a historian of the emotions. And she is the Presidential Distinguished Professor of History at Weber State University in Utah. She went to the University of Chicago as an undergrad and has a lot of Iowa connections where she grew up and ended up earning her PhD in history from Cornell University. Her first book, published by University of Pennsylvania Press, was called Keeping Up with the Joneses, Envy in American Consumer Society. Her second book was entitled Homesickness and American History, published by Oxford University Press, and that's how I first came to know Susan. It explored how Americans from the colonial era to the present grappled with the pain of leaving home. And one of the corresponding emotions of leaving home is nostalgia for back home. And she is going to talk about the role of nostalgia in Midwestern studies and history. So please welcome Susan.
Thank you. And before I start, it's the right arrow. Yep, okay, great. Thank you. Well, thanks for the invitation, John. And let me start out by saying I am not an historian of Midwestern nostalgia. I am a nostalgic historian from the Midwest. I do study the history of emotions, and as John mentioned, I wrote on the history of homesickness, and my inspiration for that came when I started really missing the Midwest, and I kind of felt like maybe there was something wrong with me because all my life I'd grown up hearing Americans move easily. They don't look back. One of the key people I read in college was Alexis de Tocqueville, who said that Americans would, build a house and move before the roof was on, and plant a garden and move before it ever came into bearing. He said Americans were not restrained by family feeling or tradition. And that made quite an impact on me. I thought the quote was quite provocative. It was further backed up when I read one of the fathers of Midwestern history, Frederick Jackson Turner, who gave his talk on the significance of the frontier in 1893 at the Chicago World's Fair. It was the 9th annual meeting of the American Historical Association. The historians met up at the Art Institute of Chicago. The fair was down the lake a bit, and it was at that occasion in 1893 that Turner enunciated how formative the frontier had been, and he talked about the, quote, dominant individualism of frontier life and said movement has been, quote, its dominant fact. Turner and Tocqueville were absolutely correct about the high mobility rates of the American people in the 19th century. The first half of the 19th century, 50% of the population moved across state lines or were moved across state lines. But in retrospect, I think they left something quite important out, that this was not easy mobility, that there was a painful element to it. I didn't know that at the time I read it, but I kept having interactions with different sources that made me wonder. One was this painting, Breaking Home Ties by Thomas Hovenden. At the exact same moment that Frederick Jackson Turner was giving his frontier talk up at the Art Institute of Chicago, 7 miles to the south, a far larger group of people were looking at this picture. It was the most popular picture at the Chicago World's Fair. It was in the Fine Arts Palace, and reporters said the space around it was, quote, always jammed and always will be. Men took off their hats before it. Women wept in front of it because they all recognized the scene of this young man about to set off for the city and the pain of leaving his family. Scribner's published this etching of it, of somebody looking at it quite pensively, and then another art critic said everybody, no matter their place in society, recognized this, quote, heartbreak chapter of their lives. So when I saw this painting in grad school, I was like, that doesn't quite fit with Tocqueville and Turner. They seem to say it's easy. This points to the difficulties. Of course, I knew historically that some people had moved on with pain. That was clear from the historical record. In my first semester of grad school, I read a fantastic essay by Jan Starobinski on the history of nostalgia, and he there documented how this man, Johannes Hofer, in 1688 created the word nostalgia to diagnose the acute pain and suffering of young people in Switzerland far from home. They had hectic fever, rapid palpitations of the heart, labored breathing, dysentery. Some were at death's door, and the only cure was to return them home. So I was very impressed by that article, but I was pretty sure it was just a European phenomenon and not an American one, because with Turner and Tocqueville in my head, I was sure Americans moved on easily. Imagine my surprise then when I moved to Utah, a place I very much wanted to be, but began to long for my parents in Chicago, and felt some displacement. I found some comfort when I talked to a colleague my first year of grad school who told me that this mountain, which looms over our town, was named Ben Lomond. It was named by a homesick Scottish immigrant, he told me, who had longed for Loch Lomond in Scotland and had inscribed her longing on the landscape. And I thought to myself, I'm not the only one who's homesick. And I stored that away and worked on other stuff, but eventually I came to think that there might be hidden histories of homesickness and nostalgia. And I have to say, it was like the easiest research I ever did because it was everywhere. And there was lots and lots of Midwestern homesickness or nostalgia in this classical sense. And what I found when I began to study that history was that rather than moving on easily, Americans felt pain and longing. Yes, they moved, but they were also often casting a backward glance over their shoulder. And they worked very hard to maintain bonds with families and communities left behind, whether it was from the Sons of Norway or the Croatian Fraternal Union, to preserve their memories and identities and connections. And in their daily lives, they demonstrated commitments and connections that were anything but pure individualism. I came to see that individualism, in fact, required mastering an emotional style, which some people did only gradually, haltingly, or unwillingly. To be clear, I found this across the nation. I don't think there was Midwestern emotional exceptionalism. I think all Americans grappled with this pain of moving on. But today I'm going to focus on the Midwest, and here's a brief outline of what I'll talk about. Let me offer a few Midwestern cases of homesickness and nostalgia to give some examples. Certainly it was evident, along with other feelings like anger and grief, among Native Americans who were forced off of their lands. This is Makate Meshe Kiakiek, also known as Black Hawk, recorded in his memoirs the pain of leaving Western Illinois when the Sac tribe was forced off of that land. He lamented he had been driven from our village and hunting grounds and not even permitted to visit the graves of our forefathers, our relations and friends. Later generations of indigenous people were also relocated against their will and documented the emotional toll that took. This was an account from 1903 from a North Dakota newspaper telling of a young man at the Carlisle Indian School who had, in the paper's words, tramped halfway across the country to return to the Cannonball Reservation in North Dakota. And he was, as they used the term, afflicted with nostalgia, right? That was the use of it then. White settlers who had more power to decide when or whether to move streamed onto the landscapes for which indigenous people still longed, yet often the settlers themselves were longing for places they had left behind. For instance, in the early 1840s, Elias Lothrop of Durham, Maine, moved to Chicago to start a store. He wrote back to his wife that he had experienced many, quote, lonesome hours, and he sometimes thought about bringing his wife to join him, but he warned her that if she did join him, quote, you must expect that you will be homesick. I confess that I have been. His homesickness must have been substantial because he returned to Maine 2 years later. Other newcomers to the Midwest stayed longer, like Henrietta Jessen, who migrated from Norway to Milwaukee. And she wrote her sisters that she actually had high hopes that America would bring her more prosperity, but nevertheless, homesick still gnaws at me hard. Black Americans who left to settle in the Midwest as part of the Exoduster movement were happy to flee the Jim Crow South, but nevertheless, they too longed for the familiar physical landscapes they left behind. In 1881, a black newspaper, the Christian Recorder, noted that a group of the Exodusters who had settled in Indiana, quote, he said of them, homesickness afflicts them not a little. They felt, quote, homesick for the brooks and for the round domes of the hills they'd left behind. But that homesickness was offset by the greater liberty they found in the region. And later generations of Black Americans who came during the Great Migration also had similarly mixed feelings. Novelist Richard Wright talked about the sadness he felt as he scanned the kind Black faces whom he was leaving behind, but then when he looked up at the big house, he was glad he was leaving. However, when he got to Chicago, he said it wasn't quite all he expected it to be. It, quote, mocked my fantasies because it was kind of not so beautiful. And Louis Armstrong likewise said when he first got to Chicago, I was fixing to take the next train back home. So nevertheless, the pull of greater liberation in the North certainly offset some of that homesickness. If moving to the Midwest caused people to long for places they'd left behind, moving away from it also did as well. During the Civil War, Alfred Lewis Castleman, a surgeon in the 5th Regiment of Wisconsin Volunteers, documented the first death in his unit. He said the soldier had died not of battle wounds, but, quote, of nostalgia, homesickness, raving to the last breath about wife and children. He was not the only one. The Surgeon General documented over 5,500 cases of clinical nostalgia in the Union Army and 74 deaths due to the condition. Those who left the Midwest in peacetime, like Clarence Darrow, even though he's moving within the region from Ohio to Chicago, he said homesickness hung around me like a heavy cloud. And he would stand on the busiest corner of Chicago, State and Madison, and wait for people to walk by him on the chance that they might be from Ohio. So he was quite lonely as well. Such public discussions of homesickness and nostalgia were common in the 19th century. People didn't feel ashamed at expressing this because homesickness was kind of a noble feeling. It tied you to home, it tied you to place, it tied you to family. There was also the concern that maybe the homesick would die of this, so there was great sympathy afforded to the homesick, and consequently people were open in discussing it. People did more than just talk about their homesickness. To cope with the feeling, the homesick, who often migrated in groups and chain migration, created institutions to sustain connections with home. They created churches, synagogues, mosques, often in the same architectural style of those they'd left behind, sometimes bringing in the same clergy from the old community to the new. They created singing clubs, dancing clubs, newspapers, and of course, dozens of fraternal organizations in every town. In Keokuk, Iowa in the 1850s, the Sons of New York held an annual festival to celebrate their shared state. In Chicago during the Great Migration, Black Americans formed state clubs, as two observers explained. But the migrants had been feeling nostalgia for the pleasant associations and longed for familiar speeches, faces, and scenes, and so they created Mississippi Club and the Alabama Club and so on. Those Midwesterners who left the region did much the same in an effort to create connections to the places they'd left behind. For instance, a sizable number of Midwesterners settled in Southern California in the early 20th century and found the sprawling city of Los Angeles both attractive and isolating. To counteract that, they began to form state organizations which were advocated by C.H. Parsons, an Iowan, who said the organizations, quote, liquidated the blues. And perhaps their most notable activity was picnics. South Dakotans had picnics, Iowans had picnics. In 1917, homesick Iowans flocked in great numbers to an Iowa picnic. 17,000 showed up. By 1935, over 100,000 were showing up, and they'd organize themselves by county and to kind of make the geography of the state through their bodies. Homesickness in all of these examples served as an emotional glue that could bind people to their home communities, as well as to those homes they shared with people from those communities. However, by the early 20th century, the national emotional culture was changing. In an age of rapid urbanization and industrialization, expanding corporate power, and a growing military presence, homesickness became a somewhat inconvenient emotion because if you're feeling homesick, the best cure for homesickness is to return home. And in fact, the Army would sometimes give furloughs to avoid people succumbing to the condition. So it was a disruptive feeling. There was also a growing sense that those who felt it were somehow unfit. Maybe they were backwards. It was often connected to people who were rural. It was seen as a provincial emotion and set in contrast to cosmopolitan people who could move on and be commercial and daring and successful. By the end of the 20th century, it had become a taboo feeling that was policed in oneself and in others, as one homesick Midwesterner discovered in 2004. Writer Catherine Lanfear, who described herself as, quote, a daughter of the prairie who had grown up in Moline, Illinois, and said she was, quote, as Midwestern as weak coffee at supper and ham sandwiches at a funeral lunch, moved to New York in 2004 to be part of Al Franken's Air America show. She was a co-host of his. She moved to Manhattan, and after the first week there, found that she was suffering from, quote, a sharp bout of homesickness. So she went to get a manicure to cheer herself up. And she confided to the Korean manicurist who was doing her nails, quote, I'm pretty homesick. But she got no sympathy. Instead, the manicurist, who was even farther from home than Lanfear, quote, sucked in some breath, and then she barked out an uppercase admonition, don't be big baby. This has become the modern attitude towards homesickness. It's a sign of immaturity and maladjustment. It must be repressed in order to succeed in contemporary society. And many Americans, including Midwesterners, have learned to perform this emotional script, though their homesickness has not dissipated. And the Midwest is still a site of considerable homesickness. We just talk about it less publicly than we once did. But its signs are still around us, whether it's in the Mexican grocery store or the soul food restaurant or the sports teams we root for from afar. But we don't talk about it as such because homesickness has this sort of stigma of immaturity. As homesickness gradually became disreputable, it lost its place as a moral emotion, and the medical diagnosis of nostalgia declined as well. However, while the word's medical meaning disappeared, the word itself did not. It gradually came to be attached to a new feeling, a longing for a lost time. And so while homesickness was about a longing for a lost place, nostalgia in its modern sense has been a longing for a lost time. Some of this came because people, had difficulties coping with the changes of modernization and longed for simpler bygone days. Sometimes people who had been homesick used modern transportation to return to those homes and found they weren't what they thought they had. They had changed, their homes had changed. They realized they were longing for a lost moment in time. So in any case, nostalgia came to take on this new meaning. While homesickness had been a disruptive emotion, this new kind of nostalgia was not nearly as disruptive. It has kind of a built-in futility to it, and for that reason, it seems more kind of socially acceptable to long for the past than to return home. Psychologists today, in fact, suggest that modern nostalgia may be a balm for loneliness, displacement, and even homesickness. You can't go home again, but you can think about it in your head, and that may bring some comfort. They often say it may bring a sense of connectedness, so long as you're longing for the same past as those next to you. However, this is where things get interesting, and this is where I'll just speculate. I studied the history of homesickness and that kind of nostalgia. I just want to speculate for 1 minute about this modern nostalgia in the Midwest. Some historians, like John Miller, South Dakotan, focused on Midwestern nostalgia, and he made a compelling case that this new kind of longing for a lost time could have a community potential for binding people together. Others, like historian Gary Cross, in his book Consumed Nostalgia, have posited that in the 20th and 21st century, nostalgia is a highly individualized experience because of fast capitalism. We all long for different commodities. We all long for slightly different artifacts of the past. And for that reason, nostalgia may be something that divides us rather than unites us. People are yearning for different pasts. While Miller may be right that modern nostalgia has the potential to be a positive communal experience, my sense right now, at least when it comes to Midwestern nostalgia, is that it is a more private and personal experience, and it stands in marked contrast to that older communal homesick nostalgia of the 19th and early 20th century. Less disruptive than homesickness, this modern nostalgia also lacks the binding capacity that homesickness the homesickness nostalgia possessed, and in some cases still possesses. For that reason, when we talk about Midwestern nostalgia in its modern sense, it proves to be a slippery subject because it is so varied and so personal. As scholars have noted, there have been many Midwests, and consequently, I don't think there can be a single unitary Midwestern nostalgia. Instead, Midwesterns harbor competing, overlapping, and sometimes contradictory visions of the good old days, which may differ quite radically from one another, and also may differ from the reality they are recalling. Today, I've tried to trace the rise and fall of homesickness and also the rise of modern nostalgia in the 21st century. I can't pretend to know what that history looks like, but it would be one that is well worth writing. Thanks.
Thank you, Susan. Our next speaker is Lee Strang. He is a native of Cascade, Iowa, and he is the inaugural director of the Salmon P. Chase Center for Civics, Culture, and Society at Ohio State University. He also holds an appointment in the Moritz College of Law at Ohio State. Professor Strang is a nationally recognized legal scholar who has published dozens of articles in leading journals on constitutional law and interpretation, and he is the co-editor of the prominent textbook, Federal Constitutional Law. His most recent book is Originalism's Promise, a natural law account of the American Constitution. Prior to teaching, Professor Strang served as a clerk for Judge Alice Batchelder of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. Professor Strang is a graduate of the University of Iowa and Harvard Law School. Please welcome Professor Strang.
Thank you so much, John. And maybe the first lawyer, but not the last lawyer, because Pat Gary is here somewhere today. So you may be saying, what's the lawyer doing here, right? And what I'm going to be doing this morning is talking about a project I've been engaged in now for about 3 years, which is building, or maybe in some people's view, rebuilding citizenship education in the United States, and even more specifically in the Midwest, and even more specifically at you forgot the definitive article, John, the Ohio State University. I'm contractually required to say that. No, not really. So the title of my remarks this morning is The Place of the Midwest in American University-Level Citizenship Education. My thesis is that the Midwest and Midwestern studies has a necessary place within American civic thought, which is another name for citizenship education, for at least 3 reasons. First, the Midwest is an example of American regionalism, the knowledge of which is a necessary part of the American civic tradition. Second, the Midwest's own significant contributions to our nation necessitate knowledge of this as a part of our American civic tradition. And third, study of the Midwest is important because the value it adds to state citizens whose states lie in the Midwest, learning more about their own states. I'll talk for 15 minutes. It's obviously a very rich subject, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. So I'll make 3 quick moves this morning. First, I'll summarize what I mean by the term civic thought. This will help situate my remarks. Second, I'll stipulate what I mean when I refer to the Midwest and look for your feedback, because there are many, even though I'm a native Hawkeye, as John said, and now an adopted Buckeye, I do have some lived experience, but I know there are debates about what the Midwest is. And then third, I'll mention and argue for those 3 roles that I identified in my introductory remarks. So first, what do I mean when I say civic thought? Civic thought, as I understand it, is the study, research, and teaching on the subject of citizenship, American citizenship. Its aim is to help citizens bear their responsibility for self-government, and it does so in 3 key ways. First is helping introduce young people to our shared civic tradition, so gaining knowledge about that civic tradition. Second is helping them identify and then hone and then hopefully use and practice the civic skills that allow us to live well with each other. And then third, identifying the appropriate disposition that one should have towards one's political community. And this process is one of both intellectual and moral formation. There are a number of ways I could approach describing the way in which a school of civic thought like the Chase Center would inculcate the knowledge, skills, and disposition. I could create a list, and I've got other work where I've got the list, but the approach that I want to use this morning to help us understand what I'm talking about when I think of citizenship education is what's called a focal case analysis, where we're trying to identify the best, most healthy version of a thing. And you can imagine lots of examples of that, right? So an oak tree, there are healthy and hale versions of oak trees with lots of foliage, lots of acorns, very rich, large acorns. and other less robust kind of scrawny trees, right? And so the focal case analysis is trying to discern healthy from unhealthy examples of a phenomenon. So what's the focal case of American citizenship? And one way we could think about it is thinking about great American lives well lived. So it's people who exemplify American citizenship thoroughly. And lots of candidates, right? So George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. I have the privilege of leading the Salmon P. Chase Center, so I'll talk about Salmon Chase. Now, some of you may say, like my wife said when I was asked to interview for the job, who again is Salmon Chase? So Salmon Chase is probably the most famous unknown Ohioan. So Salmon Chase, just to give you kind of a list of very briefly of some of his extraordinary civic activities, he was the leading attorney in Ohio for decades. He was the leading American pro-freedom, anti-slavery attorney in the entire United States. He edited a newspaper. He started a lyceum. He started and supported various church groups. He was the leading abolitionist advocate in the public square. As many of you know, he founded and co-founded many political parties. He held office at the local, city council, the state. He was governor of Ohio, and the federal level. He was U.S. Senator. As many of you may know from reading Team of Rivals, he was Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury. He was Chief Justice of the United States. And when you think about what allowed Salmon P. Chase to live his life well, what I'm trying to capture in citizenship education is the knowledge of our shared civic tradition that he had to have access to do all of those things extraordinarily well. The skills that he had to have, some of which, when you read Team of Rivals, right, one of the things that Doris Kearns Goodwin identifies are some of the vices that he had that maybe limited his ability to live as fully as he wanted to. So the corresponding virtues that he needed to live well. And then his disposition, his attitude towards the United States was one of a project where it was partly his story, and he was trying to make the story the best story that he could, the best story that it could be. So let me just talk about each of those items specifically: knowledge, skills, and disposition. So by the knowledge of the American civic tradition, I mean the things that we Americans share in common that to live life well we should have access to. So fundamental principles, maybe those stated in the Declaration of Independence, important events, important documents, leading figures like Salmon Chase, art, literature, our economic system, and on and on. And many of those, and we have people from different disciplines here with us today, in citizenship education, maybe most of that would actually come from the existing disciplines in the universities of folks sharing their expertise in this goal of citizenship education. Second is a set of skills. Different political regimes need different skills. So I love England as much as the next person. One of the virtues that you need in England to live well is you need to have a certain set of deference to at least certain people. You need to be able to doff your hat and say, "My Lord," or "Your Majesty." We don't do that in the United States. Instead, the disposition that we have, or the skill that we have, is actually, even with people who are leaders, we treat them in a certain way. We shake their hand. We say Mr. President, or maybe Madam President in the future. What we don't do is we don't bow like they do in England. So there's a certain set of skills, and the most important skill is the skill of civic friendship. It's the approach and then the corresponding actions of treating our fellow citizens as not just equals, but people whose good that we will, because we're jointly in the common project of flourishing in the United States. And there's lots of other corresponding skills as well. Third is this disposition. What's the attitude towards the American project that a person takes? And the attitude that we try to form with young people is that America's story is also each student's story, each of our stories. And these dispositions increase our political community's ability to collaborate and aid in pursuit of the common good. The label, which was coined by Paul Carisse, who was the first founder of one of the schools of civic thought at Arizona State, is reflective patriotism. The idea that this political community is mine. I'm going to bring to bear my reflective resources, my intellectual resources to understand it, to try to cultivate it, to make it the best version of itself. It's a very short thumbnail sketch of citizenship education. So let me move my second point, my second move, which is to stipulate and invite guidance from experts on what I mean when I say the Midwest. So defining the Midwest has proven challenging. Lots of variables, lots of different discussions on that. For my purposes, I don't need to enter into the debate about what counts as the Midwest, so long as there's a consensus that there is a phenomenon called the Midwest, and there may be states or parts of states that should or should not be included in it. In fact, it's funny. I'm in Ohio right now. I've been in Ohio now for almost 20 years. And growing up in Iowa, Ohio was not something I would have considered the Midwest, but folks in Ohio clearly consider it, and I do now consider it a part of the Midwest. So there's this debate, but so long as there's a region of the Midwest, then my next move, which is where I provide 3 reasons for including study of the Midwest in citizenship education. These are reasons why schools of civic thought like mine, or any institution of higher education whose mission is forming American citizens, at least as one part of its mission, will include study of the Midwest in their curricula. My first reason is that the Midwest is an example of American regionalism, where different parts of the United States have different characters. So study of the Midwest introduces students to this important phenomenon of our country. Stepping back for a moment, I think it's uncontroversial that different regions in the U.S. have distinct personalities and cultures. People from the Southwest live a different life to some degree than people in New England, and for a long time, the South in Southern studies was the paradigm example of regional studies. And since regionalism is a part of American civic life, civic thought should include it, because without access to the concept of regionalism, students will not have access to this important fact of American life. And I think regionalism informs our understanding of our nation in at least three ways. I'll note them relatively quickly. First, differentiating between the portions of America and understand how those different portions of America impact national policies and debates and political trends. So, for example, as somebody from Iowa who worked for Senator Grassley for once upon a moon, why do farm state senators exercise significant influence on national policy, including especially agriculture policy? And second, regionalism informs citizens about the complex structure of our country. America is, of course, one country with many parts, including many different types of parts. We have states, towns, counties, townships, school boards, and apropos today, we have regions. Understanding regionalism exemplified by the Midwest creates a more balanced view. America is not uniform, but it's not lacking unity at either. It is both uniform and diverse, and regionalism gives us access to another facet of that dynamic interplay. Third, regionalism is analogous in some ways to the most important contribution of Americans to political theory, federalism. Federalism is the system of government that divides governmental power between a national government and state governments, and federalism famously leads, this is in the legal literature, to a number of benefits for our nation. And I think it's still inchoate in my thought. Many of the benefits of federalism would also apply to regionalism. Okay, the second reason to study the Midwest in civic education is for the contributions that the Midwest itself has given to the nation as a whole. I'll note two Midwestern contributions to the United States that I think exemplify what I have in mind, but of course there are many more. First, the Midwest has contributed significantly to the developments of America's political principles. The earliest examples come from the contributions, as I mentioned earlier with Salmon Chase, to the anti-slavery movement. So the Northwest Ordinance was a national statement of freedom for a significant part of the country. That set a legal principle. The subsequent states in the old Northwest territories and then in the rest of the Midwest, which is one of the reasons why I think Missouri might not count, because it didn't adopt the posture of the Northwest Ordinance, continued that pro-freedom approach. Immigration patterns set the Midwest on a path towards being pro-liberty. Leaders from the Midwest, Abraham Lincoln, Salmon Chase, Ulysses S. Grant, and many others, advanced these principles. Midwestern states, such as Wisconsin, served as focal points of resistance to slavery. I'm thinking of the Abelman versus Booth case in the late 1850s. And Midwestern states served, of course, as lines of escape from slavery. Second, the Midwest has contributed significantly to the economic development of our country. Perhaps the greatest example is industrialization. The Midwest served as one of, if not the major contributor to the industrialization of the United States through its resources, through its transportation systems, through its manufacturing, through its industrious workforce. And of course, these 2 points are just the tip of the iceberg. So one can't know America if one doesn't know the Midwest, because then one doesn't know about the Midwest's important contributions to the United States. Finally, the third reason to include study of the Midwest in citizenship education is to inform citizens of states in those states about the specific characters that state citizenship should have for them. This idea is premised on the concept that civic education is not only teaching about being a nationally minded citizen, which of course it is, we're American citizens, but also the flourishing of each of us as our own individual state citizens. And I'll use a legal example apropos to being a lawyer, and specifically the treatment of education in Midwestern states. So the Northwest Ordinance famously included a provision that emphasized the importance of education to flourishing citizenship. And this was specifically placed in the third article of the Northwest Ordinance. And the education focus found its way into all of the Midwest's constitutions in one version or another, including Ohio. So Ohio has had 2 constitutions. The first one had almost a cut and paste of the original Northwest Ordinance language, and then the current language is an exemplification and expansion on the Northwest Ordinance language. And so the commitment to public education found its way from the Northwest Ordinance to the state constitutions in Ohio, and then other states throughout the Midwest as well. For citizens of Midwestern states, knowledge of this commitment to education, in particular public education, by the region is an important fact of their states, and so being excellent citizens requires knowledge of that fact. So what I've argued this morning is that university-level citizenship education should include Midwestern studies because the Midwest is an example of regionalism, which is a defining feature of the United States, because the Midwest owns significant contributions to the nation, and therefore Americans, citizens should know about those contributions, and third, because of the contribution of the region to the states within which the students themselves are citizens. Looking forward to our conversation. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Dr. Samuel L. Young, who is an assistant professor of history at Indiana Wesleyan University in Marion, Indiana. He is a native of Mount Vernon, Iowa, and he taught high school for several years in suburban Dallas before going back to school and earning his MA from Marquette and his PhD from Baylor University in Texas. His first book, which will be coming out from Oxford University Press, is titled Saint of the Republic, The American Myth of Martin Luther, which examines the reception of Martin Luther in American culture from the colonial era to the present. I told Sam he's got a ready-made roadmap for his book tour. He can just start with Lutheran colleges in the Midwest. He could start here in Sioux Falls at Augustana and hit all the states around here. Welcome, Sam.
All right, well, my thanks to John, the University of South Dakota, the NEH, the Midwest Review, our hosts here at the Washington Pavilion, and the other participants for what has already been a great conversation. I'm here to talk about religious history, but I actually want to start with the religious present. These numbers are from the Pew Research Center's most recent U.S. religious landscape study. This is showing the percentage of self-identified religious adherents, with the Midwest figures on the left and the national numbers in parentheses. There's been a lot of commentary among religion scholars about what these numbers mean. By far, the two most talked about elements are the continuing decline of mainline Protestantism and the rise of the so-called nones, or those who mark nothing in particular for their religious affiliation. More interesting to me is the general alignment between the Midwest as a region and the religious makeup of the nation as a whole. By the metrics of the study, the Midwest is the region whose religious adherence most closely mirrors the national reality. As some of the other panels today will discuss, Americans have often considered the Midwest as the region of the country that is most quintessentially American. And these associations encapsulate the religious culture of the region as well. Visions of country churches, Friday night fish fries, Sunday potluck suppers in the fellowship hall, Pastor Liz preaching at Lake Wobegon Lutheran Church, and the mystical voice speaking to Ray Kinsella from an Iowa cornfield. And this sense of the Midwest's spiritual significance has historically had deep resonances in the academy. I'm not the first to point this out, but it is really extraordinary just how many excellent scholars of American religion have roots in the Midwest. I'm sure there are many more, but as I was writing this talk, I was just looking at my American religion bookshelf and finding Midwest author, all the way down. I'm sure we could add more to this list. Anyway, today I want to briefly chart the ways in which historians of religion have incorporated the region into their broader narratives of American religious history, discuss some new directions in the field that hold enormous promise, and look ahead for the place of religious history in Midwestern studies. In 1832, 3 years before Lyman Beecher preached his plea for the West, the Massachusetts Sabbath School Union published a children's history of the Protestant Reformation. Written by a veteran teacher of the Sunday school movement, Ann Tuttle Bullard, the book describes a fictitious Sunday school classroom full of curious little girls and their mothers, walking through a thoroughly partisan Protestant account of medieval Roman Catholicism. Heretics are burned, inquisitions instituted, and the true faith everywhere persecuted. Into this morass of depravity and suffering, God sends Martin Luther, bringing the light of the gospel back to the dark continent of Europe. The book ends with the Sunday school teacher warning the mothers and daughters that the agents of the Pope were at this very moment infecting the young American nation with their unholy, false, and violent superstitions. The Holy Pontiff had his eyes on the West, the Ohio River Valley, the Great Lakes, and beyond. The story concludes with an exhortation to all, quote, pious families to go out and let their light shine in the valley of the Mississippi, end quote, serving as little Luthers in the cause of truth. The vision of the Midwest contained in this Sabbath school publication and preached by Beecher became the primary lens by which 19th century scholarly observers viewed the region's spiritual significance. It was a place of vitality and energy where American Protestantism could take on new forms, adapting to the conditions of the wilderness, denominations competing with one another and their Roman Catholic neighbors to establish themselves in the new states. The Presbyterian author Robert Baird, while writing the first comprehensive account of America's religious life in 1844, used agricultural metaphors to describe the Midwest's religious identity. These states were gardens in which the Eastern denominations could grow, establish churches and schools, and cultivate an extension of American civilization. Into the 20th century, scholars of American religion primarily understood the Midwest in these same terms, as a region whose historical significance began and ended with the antebellum period. It is a story largely dominated by Protestants and their competition with Catholic immigrants, the emergence of new democratic forms of Christianity, and the relationship between Midwestern denominational institutions, especially seminaries and universities, with their East Coast counterparts. Writing in the early 1950s, William Warren Sweet judged the antebellum Midwest as the arena for the formation of a distinctly American religious identity, unencumbered by the latent Old World tendencies found on the East Coast. Sidney Alstrom, in his 1972 Religious History of the American People, similarly framed the antebellum Midwest as the place in which Yankee Puritanism fully Americanized, as churches facilitated the establishment of new communities across the frontier states. Though Protestants dominate these narratives, other attempts to survey American religious history emphasize the inherent pluralism of frontier religion in the Midwest. Catholics always maintained a firm presence in American Indians, Latter-day Saints, new religious movements, and a variety of free thinkers and unbelievers all challenged this Protestant status quo. Still, these traditional narratives treat those, quote, outsiders to the Protestant mainstream as exceptions to the rule. And the Midwest, so significant for antebellum religious culture, curiously disappears from these accounts after the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Now, religious historians have been sounding the alarm on the lack of attention to regional identity for at least 4 decades. Exasperated by the ways in which earlier studies centered New England Protestantism as the center of American religious life, the discipline has expanded its field of vision, exploring religious communities beyond the Protestant mainstream, considering religion's relationship with politics, race, gender, consumerism, and popular culture. This broadening of the field has given greater attention to how geographical regions shape religious communities across differences of theology, ritual, practice, language, or ethnicity. Though much of this research on region and religion has centered on the American South or Appalachia, the borderlands, or the Mountain West, interest in the religious history of the Midwest is growing. The renaissance of Midwestern studies has certainly contributed to this in the last 10 years. Reflections on the Midwest's religious identity have graced more than one edited volume, all edited by John Lauck, discussing the region, and the Midwestern Historical Association routinely hosts several religious history panels at the annual meeting. And the attention given to the Midwest has borne scholarly fruit. The last decade has seen a veritable goldmine of excellent studies exploring many facets of the region's religious past. I'm including my favorites here. The prodigious labor of these scholars raises a question. Given the long, varied, and complex relationship between the many religious communities in the Midwest across the centuries, is any attempt at synthesis or a grand narrative inherently futile? Is a comprehensive history of religion in the Midwest even possible? On this score, a new history of religion in America, published a few months ago by Thomas Tweed, offers a compelling framework for linking region with religious identity, and in my judgment has enormous promise for thinking about a distinctive Midwestern religious identity going forward. Tweed defines religion broadly with a few key terms. In his words, religion deals with what he calls crossing or moving. Religion propels and constrains devotees as they move across all sorts of boundaries, terrestrial, corporeal, and cosmic, to flourishing or well-being. For Tweed, religion also includes dwelling or placemaking. It's about mapping, building, and inhabiting lived worlds. As humans settled, they used not only utilitarian tools, an axe or a plow, but also figurative tools, analogical language like metaphors, symbolic actions like burials, and sacred structures like churches, to transform the local ecology and construct a symbolic world. In this sense, religion is homemaking, end quote. Tweed's analysis centers the environmental context for the development of religious communities. Geography shapes the warp and woof of religion, even as religion frames the community's relationship with the environment, agricultural production, sustainability, and communal flourishing. Tweed's historical narrative pivots on significant crisis points, this is his language, when forces of political, social, environmental, or intellectual instability compel religious communities to adapt to new contexts. Tweed's approach is, I believe, particularly helpful for conceptualizing Midwestern religion. First, Tweed's definition of religion is capacious enough to include the sheer variety of religious expressions found in Midwestern history. Indigenous religions, Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Eastern Orthodox, Latter-day Saints, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, Sikhs, Jains, new religious movements, and the range of skeptics and unbelievers. Next, his emphasis on settlement, environment, sustainability crises, and adaptation are especially suited for the broader contours of Midwestern history. A study of religion in the Midwest, for instance, could adapt Tweed's broad crisis points for ones particular to the region. The Little Ice Age, French and British incursions, Anglo-American migration and settlement, destruction or displacement of native nations, sectionalism, industrialization, urbanization, rural decline, globalization. Tweed has given religious historians a new approach for considering the relationship between region and the shaping of religious communities and religious identities. I am optimistic both for the future of Midwestern studies and the place of religious history within it. However, I want to end with a sobering note and a challenge. To be blunt, we are in the middle of a national crisis of religious illiteracy. A recent survey from Pew found that Americans were generally confident in their understanding of different religions, but that this confidence did not correspond to any real knowledge about the major world religions. Further, those respondents who marked nothing in particular for their religious affiliation, this is the group growing the quickest among Gen Z, scored well below the national average. A recent example of this growing religious illiteracy came in the wake of the horrific shooting at the Latter-day Saint congregation in Michigan. And in their initial reporting, they posted an image of what they said was the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but was very clearly a Kingdom Hall of the Jehovah's Witnesses. And they to their credit, many pointed out the error, they changed it very quickly, but this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. One encouraging note from this Pew study was that researchers found a positive correlation between religious knowledge and higher education. Those who had taken religious studies or religious history courses had much higher scores. As professors, the challenge for our classrooms is, from my point of view, twofold. First, we need to rethink our scholarly assumptions about what religion is and how it affects the lives of the historical subjects that we study. To quote Catherine Lofton on religion and historical scholarship, historians have too long considered religion as, quote, the disease that secular history was born to heal. And it's worth quoting Lofton in full here, as her criticism of religion's treatment in history scholarship broadly applies just as well to religion's treatment in history classrooms. This is what Lofton says. She says, the best work on religion asks how human beings cohere together against all other poles to disunity. Also, too, the best work on religion shows how disunity, violence, and pain can result from such acts of coherence. Yet, historical work often indicts such coherence as blind dumbness. This is how historians participate in a prejudicial discourse about religion, not because historians understand religion to be weak, but because they often assign to religion a specific kind of pushing, manipulating impact that history gets over through the power of rational thought, legislative action, or social hope. This is a very partial idea of religion, and it is a very delimiting notion of society. If our students are going to be thoughtful, engaged, and curious citizens of a nation with an enormous amount of religious diversity, we need to reject the one-dimensional, constrained, and wooden understanding of religion often found in historical scholarship. This means modeling the kind of religious literacy that we want to see in our students. We should know the differences between Reform and Orthodox Judaism, Sunni and Shia Islam, why Unitarians, Latter-day Saints, and Oneness Pentecostals all reject the doctrine of the Trinity, the impact of Vatican II on American Catholicism, and what on earth distinguishes Wisconsin Synod, Missouri Synod, LCMC, and ELCA Lutherans from each other. We should know these things and be ready for when curious students ask about them. Lastly, when discussing religion in our classrooms, we need to draw on the historical resources from our local environs. I want to paraphrase a great line from Christy Nabhan Warren's recent book. It is important to do history, and religious history in particular, in our own backyards. I teach at a small school in central Indiana. When we discuss the Second Great Awakening in my survey classes, I draw on the examples of local congregations of Baptists, Presbyterians, and African Methodists. When I cover Indiana history with future social studies teachers, we discuss the distinctive beliefs of Indiana Catholics, Quakers, and Miami Indians, and explore their unique development as coherent religious communities. As more and more local archives and county history museums digitize their holdings, there are new horizons for research and teaching opportunities that can connect our students to the history of their region. The crisis of religious illiteracy is connected to many other problems plaguing our country. Some of them have already been mentioned from the stage today. Hyperpartisanship, lack of trust towards institutions and higher education in particular, and the breakdown of traditional communal structures. We're going to continue this conversation throughout the day. Teaching and thinking about the religious history of the Midwest is not a silver bullet, but it can contribute to a solution. Knowledge, appreciation, and familiarity with the diversity of religious communities from the past can become the basis for interest, engagement, and understanding here in the present. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. You're going to have to give me a primer on the difference between the Wisconsin Synod and Missouri Synod later tonight. I've forgotten. We have time for a couple questions before we go to the next panel. So if you have a question, go to the mic so that the camera people can pick this up. I wanted to start with an observation about Susan's talk. I love that image of the painting Breaking Home Ties. It still is a kind of heartbreaking image. What's interesting about this is in our current world where we're drowning in social media and cell phones, you don't have moments like that. If you put your daughter on the plane to go somewhere, well, you can text her when she's on the plane, you can follow where she's going on the plane, you can FaceTime her, you can snap and all this. So there's really not that lack of connection. So this is going to be an interesting emotional adjustment to track.
I published the book in 2011, and already, Facebook was there and smartphones were there, and people were saying like the first days of college aren't what they used to be, in that you used to say goodbye to your parents, and instead I remember calling my parents once a week with quarters, right? And now people call each other every single day or multiple times a day, or don't call probably, but text. Nevertheless, I talk to people, for instance, I talked to a woman whose sister was in San Diego and the rest of the family was in Mexico, and she said actually like FaceTiming made it harder because you could see everything you were missing, right? Yeah. And so we have the illusion, and they had this in the 1840s, that the telegraph is going to end homesickness, and I don't think it has. I think the technology just makes us aware of the distance that still lingers.
Aaron, and can you pull your mic? Everyone
Sure.
pull their mic up.
First of all, thank you, Susan. I didn't know that we had a history of emotions, but I'm really glad that we do. This is really a wonderful presentation of awareness. So I'm going to do what we did last session, and I'm going to actually see if Susan and Lee can talk about some of the same concepts here. there's a lot of movement in the 19th century, but you're bringing up into the 20th century, and you're talking about the fact that the homesickness has been replaced with a sense of nostalgia, because homesickness, if I can get that out, is somewhat taboo. It's not acceptable, socially acceptable. So part of the question I'm asking, this is how it connects with Lee, is do you see that there is a change in the sense of ownership of our identity? So if we don't have a sense of ownership, what it seems to me with Lee talking about the civic, or rebuilding a sort of a civic education, is really rebuilding a sense of ownership of our regional and our national identity. We own this is us. But if you've sort of weakened that sense of ownership, not only to the region, but actually to your parental identity and your where you come from, then it's not politically correct to be homesick, because you're not supposed to like those things that you came from. You can be nostalgic, but you don't want to have that ownership. You want to have a more cosmopolitan, universal ownership. What do you think about that as an impact on the change from the 19th to the 20th century?
That's interesting. I don't know if I'd use the word ownership. I think there has been sometimes a denial of the importance of place, and that people have been told that, geography doesn't matter, for instance, landscapes don't matter, and realizing that, our world around us, whether it's the people around us or the landscapes around us, do make lasting impressions upon us, is I don't know if I'd call that ownership, but it's certainly formative of identity, and that context matters. And I think people continue to feel homesick. So on the one hand, they're having this inner connection still, but they're not willing to talk about it. So I don't think the connection has gone away, but I think it's gone underground in some way. I don't know if that answers your question.
Lee, do you want to weigh in?
Just say a couple things. I think there's a lot of data, and it certainly fits my anecdotal experience about especially young people, but not only young people, having a lack of connection to lots of things, or really, maybe stating differently, lack of connection to really anything of enduring value. And the country would be one thing, their state, religious organizations, the rise of the nuns would be another example. Kind of a growth of the bowling alone phenomenon, or metastasization of it. There was a survey a couple of years ago that was identified, that was reported on the Wall Street Journal. People remember, if Russia attacks, what would you do? And people remember, I was stunned by the response. And the response was, I forget the exact numbers, but it was in the teens, the percentage of people below, I think, age 25 who said that they would defend the United States. Now, there could be lots of reasons why a person would put that, but it was a really low number. And so one of the things that I see, just putting my citizenship education hat on for a moment, one of the hypotheses I have, or the intuitions, is that if a person hasn't had access to the genuine goods of the United States, or their state, or their region, or their town, so Sam had mentioned the point about local history, and a person maybe has had a lot of information about negative aspects of those organizations or those places, then there's not something good there to love, right? If you don't have something that's good, then it's not something to love. And if it's not something that we have common shared goods that we can share our love of, then it metastasizes into polarization. And so one of the points of the citizenship education is to help people see the genuine goods that we share, although debate about how they're manifested, how we live up to them or don't live up to them, as the case may be. And so I don't know if that's an exact response to your question, but that's a way in which I think the lack of participation or perspective of ownership of our political community is related to a lack of access to the goods that we have.
We'll give the last question to Pat Gary before we take a very quick break.
Thank you all for some fascinating presentations. Professor Strang, I wanted to ask you a question about, it seemed like the last time we may have had a kind of a major citizenship kind of crisis or controversy. It was late 19th century, early 20th century. And our response to that was the kind of Ellis Island assimilation model. So how do we then inculcate this notion of like citizenship, civic virtue, if we've moved beyond the assimilation model?
That's a great question. I would actually say the analogy that I have, and I appreciate your point, Professor Gary, about late 19th, early 20th century assimilation model. The model that comes to mind for me that I think is most relevant, at least to the project I'm currently engaged in, is actually the right around the antebellum period, where, and actually we heard some of that from Sam just a little bit before. There's lots of folks moving in to the country. They had the wrong kind of religion. There was a brutal civil war. There was healing or lack thereof. And so, how does a state like Ohio respond to to that deep polarization? And one of the ways was the creation of universities like the Ohio State University. And one of its focus, though not the only focus, was on citizenship education. And I guess, I don't know if this is a negative word, there is an assimilationist aspect to it. Maybe the way I would characterize it is there's an invitation to it, right? So there's an invitation of, here are the things that this political community thinks is valuable, and we're inviting you to experience the value and the goodness of those things as well. And I'm not an expert on the assimilation or lack thereof at different points in time. And so maybe, I don't know if assimilation would be the goal, but invitation, and then the insight is that the goods that we have are so good, or genuinely in fact good, that people will voluntarily start participating in them.